Dr. Muso. Today we want to talk about A-level history. We want to talk about paper one, A-level history, paper one. What we have on this paper for A-level. So this paper for A-level, it usually examines students on Zimbabwean history. This paper, we see that it contains sections A up to section D. So we'll be having four sections covering about Zimbabwean history. So which are the topics that we have on this paper, the Zimbabwean paper for advanced level? Here are the topics. Let's start with section A. On section A, we've got so many topics. One of the topics that we have is the sources of history. For us to be in a position to know about historical events, we are supposed to use sources. We talk about oral tradition. We also talk about written records, archaeology, rock paintings. We also talk about linguistics. We also talk about anthropology, which talks about the core police, social organization activities that were done by the people survived long ago. So a question may come on the sources of history that are used to know or to explain more about the ways of life that were done by the early people. Then we also talk about the Stone and also the Iron Age period. What took place during the Stone Age period? What also took place during the Iron Age period? The changes that occurred from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. Did the people benefit from those changes that took place from the Stone Age period to the Iron Age period? Then we also have got these Khoi and also the same people, the early inhabitants of southern and eastern Africa. The same people, we see that coming from southern Africa, the Khoi coming from the East Africa. So we also talk about the Khoi and the Senwat people. And we also have got a topic today on our great Zimbabwe, the first state that we have. We also have the state that is known as the Mapungubwe state. Mapungubwe state collapsing. When it collapsed, a new state, it was formulated, which was known as Great Zimbabwe. So we talk about the origins of Great Zimbabwe, the controversies that we have on the origins of Great Zimbabwe. We also talk about the rise of Great Zimbabwe. We also talk about the political, the economical, and the social activities that took place at Great Zimbabwe. We also talk about the downfall of Great Zimbabwe, the internal and the external factors that led to the downfall of Great Zimbabwe. So you are supposed to know about this topic known as Great Zimbabwe. So these are the topics that we have on section A, Zimbabwean history. Then on section B, which are the topics that we have on section B? We have got a state that is known as the Mutapa state. What took place on the Mutapa state? Talk about the origins of the Mutapa state, the rise of the Mutapa state, the economical, the political, the social activities that took place in the Mutapa state. Then we talk about the downfall of the Mutapa state, the internal factors and also the external factors. The Portuguese are playing an important part in the downfall of the Mutapa state. Then we talk about the Roji state, the origins of the Roji state, the rise, the economical, the political, the social, and the downfall of the Roji state. We talk about the Nguni incursions that led also to the downfall of the Roji state. Those groups that fled from Chaka fighting with the Roji led to the downfall of the Roji state. We talk about the Ndebele state, the origins of the Ndebele state, the journeys of the Ndebele, Ekupumuleni, Emutlatandila, Mariko, Murute, Mosega. Those journeys, the economical, the political, the social, and also the Ndebele Shona relations. So you're supposed to know about the Ndebele state. Then you know about the missionary activities. The missionary activities are in Zimbabwe. You talk about their activities in Mashonaland. You also talk about their activities in Matebeleland. Then you talk about their successes. Were they successful in preaching the gospel both in Mashonaland and also in Matebeleland? Then you talk about the occupation of Zimbabwe. Cecil John Johnson Rhodes are paving way for the colonization of Zimbabwe using his financial muscle to occupy Zimbabwe. You talk about the Grobbler Treaty, the Moffat Treaty, the Rad Concession. You also talk about the BSAC, their movement to Zimbabwe, and eventually the occupation of of Zimbabwe. So you should know about the occupation of Zimbabwe. Then you talk about the Anglo-Ndebele War of 1893, the causes that led to the Anglo and Ndebele war. You talk about the long-term causes and also the short-term causes. Jameson's character, the issue of minerals, the issue of boundaries, the issue of a railroad line. You also talk about the Anglo-Ndebele War being caused by the Gomara or the Victoria incident. You talk about that. Why were the Ndebele defeated in the Anglo-Ndebele War of 1893 and 94? Then you talk about the first Chimurenga, whereby the local people, the Shona, the Ndebele, they take up their arms, they to fight against the whites. You talk about the causes that led to the first Chimurenga, loss of land, loss of independence, forced labor, etc. You are supposed to know about what this topic. You talk about the role that was played by religious leaders, and you explain why the Ndebele and the Shona, they were defeated in these uprisings of 1896 and 97. Then section C, you are supposed to talk about colonial administration. What took place now that the Ndebele, now that the Shona, they were defeated. So you're supposed to talk about what took place from 1898 up to 1923, during the time of the orders in a council. The reforms that were now being introduced by the whites during this particular period of time. Our country also now being named Rhodesia after Rhodes. Rhodes, when he died in 1902, they had to name it Rhodesia, A-I-N-A. We now have got Rhodesia. All this took place during this particular period of what? Of time. Then you talk about the responsible government from 1923 to 1953. So many reforms again are taking place here. Developments in Mashonaland, developments in Matebele. You talk about these developments. You also talk about the Land Apportionment Act of 1930. It took place during this particular period of time. So many acts being introduced also during this particular period of time. You also talk about the methods that were used by the whites to recruit labor. You also talk about the ways how the Africans reacted to the brutalities that they were experiencing against the against the whites. So you talk about here. You also talk about peasant agriculture. It also comes here. Then you talk about the federation. Why the federation was started? The advantages of formulating this federation. Why eventually the federation was abolished in 1963. So it's a familiar topic again. You are supposed to cover it. That is the Federation of Rhodesia, talking about Nyasaland, Southern Rhodesia, and Northern Rhodesia. Then you talk about the UDI, Ian Douglas Smith, on 11 November 1965, declaring the unilateral Declaration of Independence, declaring that the Africans, they were not going to rule them, they were not going to rule themselves in their lifetimes. So you talk about what Smith did during his reign when he was now the leader of Southern Rhodesia. Then you talk about post-independence, what are activities? You talk about the Lancaster Conference, the importance, the significance of the front-line states. You talk about Zambia. You talk about countries now assisting Zimbabwe, Tanzania playing an important part, Mozambique playing an important part. You also talk about Cuba. You also talk about China. You talk about Russia assisting Zimbabwe so that Zimbabwe was going to be liberated. So we are talking about the period for the liberation struggle, the causes that led to the second Chimurenga, the role that was played by songs, role that was played by the Chimguidos, role that was played by the guerrillas, role that was played by the peasants, role that was played by the women, so that they could liberate our country, Zimbabwe. So all that comes on this section C. Then section D, now we talk about Zimbabwe after 1980. What happened in Zimbabwe after 1980? They can ask you a question on that, or they can ask you a question on current history. What is taking place in Zimbabwe? They can give you an example. For example, the land reform program. For example, the policies that were introduced by the government, e.g. ISAP, how people benefited from the policies that were being introduced by the government. So this section now, it covers current information. The history that took place in Zimbabwe, that is taking place in Zimbabwe when we attained our independence in 1980, what happened in the 1990s, what happened, what is also taking place today. So it's a section that wants you to know about the current history. So these are the sections that we have. So we've got 4 sections. So from these 4 sections now, you have to answer 4 questions from at least 3 sections. So what can you do? You can pick 1 question from here, 1 question from here, 1 question from here, 1 question from here. So at least you've answered 4 questions from at least 3 sections, or you can pick 2 questions from here, you pick 1 question from section B, then you pick 1 question from a section what? From section C. So by so doing now, you could have answered 4 questions from at least what? 3 what? Sections. Remember, when we answer questions at A level, it means that you have to support them, you have to read, you have to have information, and you have to answer your examination or your exam in 3 hours. So you should budget your time correctly. So that is what we have on this paper, History A Level, paper 1. Thank you so much. It's Dr. Muso.